Today, I'm pleased to announce members of my science and technology team. Dr. John Holdren has agreed to serve as Assistant to the President for Science and Technology and Director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy.
John P. Holdren is the resident science czar of the Obama White House. He's the head of the White House Council on Science and Technology, key advisor operating out of the new Executive Office building in Washington, D.C. This man is a Malthusian fanatic. He's a follower of Bentham and Malthus and Darwin. In other words, the main philosophers of the British Empire in the 19th century and the fountainhead of reactionary and anti-human ideology in that time frame. He's a radical environmentalist, an ecological fanatic, a green kook, a wacko, except that it's also very sinister because the implications of his belief structure and his world outlook are genocide. He is, in particular, an enemy of the traditional American point of view on the world. Holdren polemicizes in his books against people he calls the cornucopians, people who think that the bounty of nature and of production is unlimited. He says that's not true. There are limits to growth, and we have to live within those limits. He polemicizes against growthsmanship, that you can grow your way out of a crisis. According to Holdren, that door has been permanently closed on all of us. And in particular, he says he hates the moonshot mentality of the average American. And that is to say, with the right kind of national mobilization, technology, and political will, you can do just about anything, including putting a man on the moon or putting other people out into space. So Holdren is anti-American in this deep way. He is a pessimist culturally and historically. He calls himself a neo-Malthusianism. Now, the heart of his outlook is what he calls, he says that population is the root of all human problems. In other words, people pollute. Humanity is a cancer on the face of the earth. The one big problem in the ecosystem is the role of humankind. And of course, in reality, the existing ecosystem could not survive without the constant contributions of human production. It's very easy to show that. Holdren started off in the 1970s with Paul Ehrlich, who was a charlatan and an obscurantist and a crackpot who wrote the book The Population Bomb. Ehrlich was convinced that world population was growing out of control and that this is going to lead to a breakdown of human civilization sometime in the late 20th century. And it goes together with the campaign of the limits of growth, the Club of Rome, Aurelio Peccei, and the rest of these people. This is kind of the intellectual milieu that Holdren comes out of. Now, there was no population bomb. It's just not true. It never happened. Population in Europe is falling. If you just look at the self-renewal of these populations. Same thing in Japan, same thing in Russia. They've all got a demographic problem which has nothing to do with overpopulation. It has to do with shrinking population. China has demographic problems that were caused by going along with this two-child per family policy. The U.S. would be experiencing demographic decline if it weren't for the flow of immigrants into the country. So there never was a population bomb. But Holdren does not revise or change his pseudoscientific outlook because of this. Population is the problem. Now, he looks around the world, writing in the early 1970s in one of his textbooks, and he says, some countries have so much population that they ought to be triaged. We should cut them off, give them no more food aid, no more credit, no more help of any kind. Well, what are the countries? He says India is probably on the list. India, hundreds and hundreds of millions of people, and Holdren says, cast them into the outer darkness. Then Bangladesh, with a couple of 100 million people, Holdren says, for sure, Bangladesh has got to be triaged. Give them nothing. Now again, the note of genocide. the idea that whole countries should be consigned to doom puts Holdren in a league which is far beyond Hitler in terms of the number of victims that these policies would result in. He hates science and technology. He wants to limit science and technology. He regards them as a threat to what he thinks of as the social order, and also to the crackpot views of charlatans and fakers like himself. He says he wants to create a science court that would decide which inventions could be put into practice and which would have to be banned. This is unbelievable. This would essentially strangle the source of human progress and consign us all into a stagnation and ruin which would never end. Holdren believes that there's a world optimum population, or carrying capacity. Now, the idea of carrying capacity comes from the writings of a Venetian kook by the name of Gianmaria Ortes, O-R-T-E-S, writing in 1790 or thereabouts. Ortes said that the limit of the world population was 3 billion people, and that if you went beyond that, you'd have famine and starvation and death, and it would always tend back to 3 billion people. Now, Holdren is even worse. He's more genocidal than Gianmaria Ortes. He's more genocidal than Malthus, who followed in the footsteps of Ortes. Holdren says that the optimum world population is 1 billion. Now let's pause. At the time Holdren wrote that, the world population was already 4 billion. Today, if you say the optimum population is 1 billion, it would mean that more than 5 billion would have to go. And again, these are orders of magnitude that Hitler, Stalin, and Mao never dreamed of. Only in the mind of fanatics like Holdren do we get genocide of these proportions. Holdren says that the big task of policy, and here the third world and developing countries should take note. He says the main political problem facing the world is not world economic development, but stopping world economic development. He's very worried that countries like China and India and others, Latin America, South Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, that they're going to try to imitate the development of the US, Europe, and Japan. And Holdren says that would be catastrophic. What we need is to stop third world development. We've got to convince the third world not to do that. And we've got to institute de-development worldwide. In other words, turn back the clock of history, roll back progress, and go back to what amounts to pre-industrial civilization. Well, pre-industrial civilization is a lifespan of 30 to 35 years, nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes put it. So that's what Holdren wants for you and your family. In order to enforce this, he talks about a supranational monstrosity that he calls a planetary regime. This means a world empire, a supranational, one-world government that would attempt to control all details of human life. Would start with what he calls the global commons. That is to say, anything that impacts the air, the soil, and the oceans would become the subject of international, supranational intervention. It would be like the IMF on steroids. Instead of just economic life, it would extend to everything. Again, the temperature in your living room, the kind of car you have, the amount you get to eat, whether you have a pet. I mean, minimal details about your everyday life. For individual countries such as the US, Holdren recommends a population law which would fix the outer limits of the acceptable population. And again, what happens if you are surplus? What happens if you are declared a useful leader? He doesn't say that so explicitly, but it's clear that you wouldn't fare very well. So one of the features of a population law, in Holdren's point of view, is to regulate the size of the family. And this is what, of course, China did in the post-Mao period, the two-child per family policy. So the hand of the totalitarian state intervenes in the most intimate decisions of the family, and the realm of individual responsibility pretty much ceases to exist. Now, Holdren is willing to do just about anything to, first of all, slow the rate of population increase. That's his first goal. Secondly, to bring population into stasis or equilibrium, zero growth, but then to turn it back and have a decreasing, diminishing world population. The Chinese experience is if you do that, you're flirting with economic collapse. But Holdren doesn't care about that. He's, of course, a fanatic. So what is he willing to do? He talks about all kinds of forced sterilization. That you can have surgical interventions on males. In India, he says, there was a policy of obligatory vasectomy once you had 2 children in the family if you were a government employee. He says that's something we could think about imitating. Compulsory abortion. Think about that. That would be something that was flirted with in post-Maoist China. He wants to have licenses for birth. In other words, a woman is not allowed to give birth unless she's purchased a marketable birth license. And of course, what happens if Goldman Sachs comes in and, because women are going to want those, drives up the price 100 times so that nobody can afford a birth permit? And what happens to people that are born illegitimately, meaning without a birth permit? He wants to have things that have been done in the meantime. Norplant, I think, is an example. Subcutaneous chemical devices that are put into the flesh of women to prevent them from conceiving. So, forced sterilization, compulsory abortion, forced vasectomy, birth licenses, subcutaneous implants, all kinds of compulsory, obligatory methods. In terms of forced sterilizations, he says you could do this by putting chemicals in food and water, but he thinks that these other methods would be more effective. He also has other methods of persuasion, which are really coercion, that if you have more than 2 kids in the family, there's no more free public education for you. The 3rd kid has to pay to go to the public school. If you're living in public housing, which is the case in some countries, the 3rd kid gets you kicked out of the public housing and you become homeless. He's also in favor of violating the family by seizing babies. He says that if it's a teenager or a minor who has had an illegitimate child and there's no husband in the picture, then the government should come in and seize that child and have a policy of forced adoption to take care of that illegitimate child. You can see that Holdren is a collectivist. He is not a collectivist of the Marxist type, however. I would call him a collectivist in the tradition of Rousseau for 2 reasons. Remember, there are 2 Rousseaus. One is the Rousseau who says that the noble savage is the goal of human life. In other words, the more primitive you are, the less civilization you have, the better you are. Just if you think about that, Rousseau on that basis is one of the most influential philosophers of the current time, because it basically says primitive societies are better than corrupt modern society, so we should go back to nature and go back to the ways of these underdeveloped peoples. But then there's the other side of Rousseau, which is the collective will. The late Rousseau writes about the collective will, and that the individual counts nothing compared to the collective will. This is essentially the philosophy of the reign of terror in the French Revolution, and that's pretty much where Holdren is. So I would call him a Rousseauvian fanatic, in addition to being a Malthusian and a Darwinist and a Benthamite, and he wants to have the noble savage, roll back civilization, go back to pre-industrial civilization, or call it civilization if you want to, and at the same time he wants to impose the collective will. He even writes about infanticide. He says that infanticide is found in many primitive peoples, and he says, well, what that means is that these societies thought that the survival of the group and the collectivity was more important than the individual, so they didn't hesitate to kill babies, which implies Holdren's idea of civilization. It's a form of